Empires can vanish in the blink of an eye. The collapse of the Bronze Age was one of history's most dramatic unravelings, a catastrophic decade of fire that erased mighty kingdoms and reset the course of civilization. By the end of this story, you will understand the fragile threads that hold any society together and see the startling reflections in our own world today. How did a network of prosperous empires from Greece to Egypt disintegrate so completely? Who were the mysterious warriors that appeared from the sea? We will follow the clues left in ashes and ancient texts to reconstruct a perfect storm of disaster. What do you believe is the greatest threat to a connected world? It was a world of astonishing sophistication, one that might feel strangely familiar to us today. Across the Mediterranean and Near East, from the palaces of Mycenae to the temples of Thebes, a complex system of trade and diplomacy flourished. Think of it not as a collection of isolated kingdoms, but as the very first globalized economy. Great powers like the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and the new Kingdom of Egypt were locked in a delicate balance, their rivalries managed through intricate treaties and a constant flow of letters baked onto clay tablets. The lifeblood of this entire age was bronze, an alloy that required two distant ingredients, tin and copper, to be brought together through vast, fragile supply chains. Merchant ships crisscrossed the sea, carrying not only these vital metals but also luxury goods, ideas, and even diplomatic brides between royal courts. This network created immense wealth and a shared aristocratic culture, where elites from Greece to Mesopotamia might appreciate similar art, music, and weaponry. Stability was maintained through this web of mutual dependency, a recognition that prosperity for one kingdom often meant prosperity for all. But this very strength contained a hidden and profound vulnerability. The entire glittering edifice was built on a foundation of long-distance links, and when those links began to strain, the shock would travel through the entire system with devastating speed. The peace and prosperity of this international age made it uniquely unprepared for the chaos that was coming. Then the horizon darkened with ships. This was not a fleet of traders, but a flotilla of desperation and fire, carrying warriors and their families toward the shores of a crumbling world. The ancient Egyptians, who witnessed this terrifying spectacle firsthand, left us the most vivid account carved in stone at Medinet Habu. They called them the Sea Peoples, a name that echoes through history as a label for a catastrophic mystery. These were not a single nation, but a confederation of groups, a wave of humanity on the move. Their exact origins are one of history's great puzzles, with scholars proposing they came from the shattered islands of the Aegean, the failing states of Anatolia, or even distant regions caught in a domino effect of collapse. What is clear is that they were both refugees and conquerors, a migratory force with everything to lose. Their assaults were catastrophic in scale and strategy. They did not simply raid a coastline and sail away. They launched sustained campaigns intended to settle and conquer. One by one, the fortified coastal cities that served as the vital hubs of Bronze Age trade, the ports where tin met copper and luxuries changed hands, fell to their attacks. These were not just military defeats, they were strategic amputations. With each harbor city burned, a critical node in the international network was severed. The flow of goods, information, and diplomatic contact simply stopped. The most stunning casualty of this onslaught was the mighty Hittite Empire, a superpower that had rivaled Egypt for centuries. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, deep in the Anatolian heartland, was not burned by the Sea Peoples directly, but their destruction of the coastlines and trade routes strangled the empire. Cut off from supplies and allies, the central authority evaporated. Almost overnight, one of the world's greatest empires vanished from the stage of history, its people scattered and its language forgotten for over 3,000 years. The Sea Peoples were the spark that landed in a tinderbox, but the conditions for the fire had been building for generations. While warriors struck from the sea, a far more patient and pervasive enemy was tightening its grip on the land. The very climate that had nurtured these great civilizations began to turn against them. Paleoclimatology, the science of studying ancient weather patterns, has uncovered a chilling truth locked within tree rings and layers of lakebed sediment. Starting around the year 1200 BCE, a prolonged period of severe drought and erratic temperatures descended across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Researchers refer to this as the 3.2 kiloyear event, a climatic shift so profound its signature is found worldwide. For societies built entirely on the predictability of harvests, this was a catastrophe in slow motion. Imagine the life-giving Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carrying less water each season. Picture rain clouds that never arrived, fields that baked hard under a relentless sun, and grain stores that dwindled to nothing after a second, then a third failed harvest. Famine is not just a shortage of food, it is the unraveling of a social contract. The palatial economies of the Bronze Age were immense engines that required constant fuel. They fed standing armies, supported sprawling bureaucracies of scribes and tax collectors, and financed the artisans and traders who created their cultural splendor. All of that depended on a massive agricultural surplus. When that surplus vanished, everything began to crumble. Hunger breeds desperation and erodes loyalty. Farmers who could not pay their taxes might abandon their land. Local governors might hoard what little grain remained, defying the central king. Entire communities, watching their children grow weak, would have felt the terrible pull of migration, becoming part of those desperate streams of people searching for a place, any place that could still support life. This great drought did not cause the collapse by itself, but it made every other problem infinitely worse. It transformed stable kingdoms into tinderboxes of social unrest, weakened armies through malnutrition, and made the lure of raiding a neighboring land seem like a matter of survival. The climate crisis silently sapped the strength of empires, leaving them gaunt and vulnerable just as the storm from the sea arrived at their shores. The palaces themselves began to turn from symbols of security into fortresses of fear. Within the grand walls where kings and scribes once managed the wealth of nations, a new and intimate threat was growing. The very structure of Bronze Age society, with its immense concentration of power and grain in palatial storehouses, created a dangerous fault line. For generations, this system worked, a social contract where the common farmer or artisan contributed their labor and received protection and redistribution in times of need. But a contract is only as strong as the ability of both sides to uphold it. When the droughts withered the fields and the storehouses grew alarmingly empty, that ancient promise was broken. The elite could no longer provide what they had always promised, and in that failure, loyalty curdled into resentment. Why should a family starve while, just over the hill, the palace walls still stood tall? The ruling class, now besieged by external crises, may have responded by demanding more from a people who had less to give, tightening their grip just as the foundation gave way. This was not merely an economic failure, it was a profound loss of faith. The king was no longer seen as the shepherd of his people, but as a hoarder of the last scraps of survival. Archaeological clues from places like the Mycenaean palace at Pylos tell a silent but telling story. Researchers note evidence of hurried, desperate fortifications, not just around the palace citadel itself, but within it, as if the rulers feared an attack from their own subjects. The lower towns surrounding these centers were often abandoned first, suggesting people withdrew or were driven away, fracturing the community into isolated, suspicious fragments. This internal unraveling meant that when the ships finally appeared on the horizon, many kingdoms were already fighting a war on two fronts. their own social fabric tearing apart from within even as enemies gathered without. A society divided against itself cannot stand, and in the final, fiery decade of the Bronze Age, that division proved as lethal as any invading army. The final, fatal blow was a silent one, a severing of the very arteries that kept the age alive. At the heart of this sophisticated world was a simple but profound technological dependency: bronze. This strong, versatile metal was not a single mined resource. It was a marriage of two others, copper and tin, which almost never came from the same place. Copper was plentiful around the Mediterranean, from the island of Cyprus to the mountains of Anatolia. But tin, the crucial ingredient that transformed soft copper into hard bronze, was astonishingly rare. The primary sources for the great kingdoms were thousands of miles apart, in places like distant Afghanistan and perhaps as far as Cornwall in Britain. This meant the entire military and economic might of empires relied on a fragile, continuous ribbon of trade, a ribbon that stretched across seas, through mountain passes, and between rival kingdoms. The workshops of Mycenae, the armories of the Hittites, the foundries of Egypt, all waited for that next shipment of precious tin to arrive. When the coastal cities, the vital ports of call and exchange, began to fall to raids and unrest, that ribbon was cut. A single clay letter found in the ruins of Ugarit, a major Syrian port, captures the moment of realization. It is a desperate plea from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, explaining he cannot send the requested troops because his own ships are away, and more chillingly, because enemy ships have already been sighted burning cities along the coast. This was not just an attack on a city, it was an attack on a network node. With Ugarit's harbor in ashes and the Hittite Empire's overland routes in chaos, the tin simply stopped moving. Imagine the slow, grinding halt that followed. A blacksmith cannot make a bronze sword without tin. A farmer cannot have a new bronze plowshare. An army cannot replace its broken spear points or shattered chariot fittings. The very material that defined the age became suddenly, terrifyingly scarce. This was a domino effect of shortage. The fall of one trade hub did not just impoverish one kingdom, it triggered a cascade of industrial paralysis across the entire connected world. Societies that could no longer forge new tools or weapons were not just weakened, they were frozen in time, unable to maintain the complex infrastructure that supported them. The Bronze Age did not end because people forgot how to make bronze. It ended because the system that delivered its ingredients had been utterly destroyed. This was a world where no kingdom was an island, even if it was literally surrounded by sea. The very interconnectedness that had fueled centuries of prosperity created a terrifying new kind of vulnerability, a domino effect of collapse. Each of these empires was a node in a vast, living network. They did not just trade goods, they traded security. A treaty with the Hittite Empire, for example, was not merely a piece of diplomatic parchment for Egypt. It was a vital northern shield, a buffer that absorbed threats and maintained a stable frontier. Intelligence flowed along these same routes, with kings sending frantic letters to warn each other of unrest or approaching armies. The entire system operated on a principle of mutual support, a collective strength that made them all feel secure. But a network's strength is also its greatest point of failure. When one critical node fails, the shock does not simply stop at the border. It radiates outward, overloading everything that remains. The fall of the Hittite capital Hattusa was not just the end of an empire. It was the rupture of a fundamental support beam in the architectural blueprint of the age. For Egypt, it meant the sudden disappearance of a powerful counterbalance and a trusted, if sometimes rivalrous, partner. The chaos that consumed the Hittite lands did not stay there. It spilled southward in the form of displaced populations, rogue warlords, and severed trade routes, placing immense and unexpected strain on Egypt's own resources and defenses. The remaining kingdoms now had to shoulder burdens they were never designed to carry, like a chain where, when one link snaps, the weight suddenly yanks on all the others with brutal force. This ancient lesson in systemic risk feels unsettlingly familiar. In our own globally connected world, we see how a financial crisis in one nation can trigger a worldwide recession, or how a disruption in one part of a supply chain can halt factories on the other side of the planet. The Bronze Age collapse stands as one of history's earliest and starkest warnings, a demonstration that interdependence without resilience is a fragile bargain. The very ties that bind a golden age can become the cords that strangle it when the world turns dark. The silence that followed the collapse was perhaps its most profound feature. To understand how a civilization simply stops, we can look to the sun-baked hills of ancient Greece, to the kingdom of Mycenae. Here, the mighty Lion Gate still stands, a stone sentinel guarding the ruins of what was once a glittering palace complex. This was not a backwater, but the heart of a sophisticated warrior society, the world of Agamemnon from later legend. Yet around the year 1200 BCE, the palace was consumed by a great fire. Archaeology reveals this was not an isolated accident, but part of a pattern. One by one, the great citadels of the Mycenaean world, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, all show layers of ash and violent destruction from this same narrow window of time. The trigger remains a subject of intense debate. Were these the final, desperate assaults of the Sea Peoples, breaching the formidable walls, or was the fire lit from within, the climax of that internal social breakdown we discussed, a rebellion of a starving and disillusioned populace against their rulers? The most compelling answer is that it was likely both, a fatal convergence. External pressure squeezed the kingdom like a vise, while internal fractures made it brittle, ready to shatter. The outcome, however, is chillingly clear. In the generation that followed, the population of Greece may have fallen by as much as 90%. The intricate bureaucracy that managed the economy, recorded on clay tablets in a script called Linear B, vanished completely. The knowledge of writing itself was lost for centuries. The wide-ranging trade networks that brought amber, ivory, and ideas shriveled into nothing. What remained was a shattered landscape of isolated villages, a world stripped of its complexity, where the grand stories of kings and heroes faded into oral tradition, the seeds of future epics born from the ashes of a forgotten reality. This was the Greek Dark Age, a centuries-long twilight that serves as the ultimate case study in how a civilization can be extinguished not by a single cataclysm, but by a perfect storm of interconnected failures. The palaces did not just burn, they were never rebuilt because the entire system that made them possible was gone. Beneath the soil of ancient tells, the story is written not in ink, but in fire and rubble. An archaeologist's trowel, carefully scraping through the accumulated layers of history, will often find a dramatic and sobering change. One moment, they are in a stratum of everyday life with pottery shards and domestic artifacts, and the next, they hit a thick, dark line of pure devastation. This is a destruction layer, a universal signature of calamity left behind when a city meets a violent end. Across the landscape of the late Bronze Age collapse, from the legendary walls of Troy to the bustling port of Ugarit, this same dark band appears again and again, all dating to within a narrow, terrifying window between the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. These layers are time capsules of a single horrific moment. They consist of pulverized mud brick turned to ashy powder, stones blackened by intense heat, and the collapsed rubble of upper floors. Within this matrix, researchers sometimes find the poignant, silent testimonies of that final day. A collection of precious jewelry left behind in a corner, perhaps hastily hidden and never retrieved. A scatter of arrowheads or a single, broken sword, hinting at a last stand. These are not the artifacts of a slow, peaceful abandonment. They are the evidence of acute, concentrated violence, of societies that did not fade away but were struck down. The sheer geographic spread of these identical destruction layers tells a compelling story. It was not one city that fell to a local dispute or a natural disaster, but a whole network of urban centers, from the Aegean coast all the way to the Levant, experiencing the same fiery fate within a generation. This pattern transforms the collapse from a vague historical concept into a tangible, widespread reality. The landscapes of the eastern Mediterranean were not merely depopulated, they were physically scarred, their greatest achievements reduced to a uniform stratum of ash, waiting centuries for someone to read its grim message. Yet these silent ruins are not our only window into the final days. We can actually hear the desperate voices of the collapse, preserved in the very moment their world was ending. Across the burned palaces, archaeologists have uncovered archives of clay tablets, the last messages sent between kings and administrators. These are not dry historical records, they are raw, unedited cries for help, frozen in time. One of the most haunting comes from the port city of Ugarit. In its final hours, a scribe baked a letter onto a tablet, a frantic warning to the neighboring king of Cyprus. It reports that enemy ships have already been sighted, that cities along the coast are burning. Then comes a line of pure, paralyzing dread. The writer states, "My cities are burned, and they have done evil things in my country." He concludes, "I am like a bird in a trap. This letter was never sent. It was found in the oven where it was being fired, a message that never made it out of a city that would soon be ash." The metaphor is devastating. A ruler who once commanded armies now reduced to a helpless creature, watching the walls of its cage close in. Equally poignant are the last communications of the Hittite Empire. As the Great Drought strangled Anatolia, the Hittite king sent urgent pleas to his only remaining peer, the Pharaoh of Egypt. The tablets, found in both Hattusa and the Egyptian capital, are desperate requests for emergency grain shipments to stave off mass starvation. Imagine the scene: the ruler of a once mighty superpower, forced to beg for food from a former rival, his authority reduced to a matter of basic survival. These primary sources strip away the grand narrative of empires and collapses and bring us face to face with the human reality of administrators, soldiers, and kings, sitting in crumbling rooms watching the unthinkable unfold. They wrote of panic, of helplessness, of logistical nightmares as supply lines snapped and reports of destruction flooded in. Their words, often unsent and discovered in the rubble of their own burned offices, give us something profound: the emotional fingerprint of a civilization in its death throes, a reminder that history is not just about events, but about the people who lived through them. The final, desperate letters were not the only legacy of the Age of Fire. When the survivors looked back, they did not see a neat historical timeline. They saw a world of monsters, heroes, and gods. The cataclysm that erased their grandparents' reality was too vast, too traumatic, to be remembered as a simple sequence of events. Instead, it seeped into the bedrock of story, becoming the fertile ground from which some of our greatest ancient myths would grow. Think of the Greek epic cycle, the grand tales of the Trojan War, and the brutal, decade-long wanderings that followed. At its heart, this is a story about a colossal coalition war against a powerful eastern city, ending in its fiery destruction. The heroes who fought there, like Agamemnon and Odysseus, then faced horrific journeys home, only to find their own kingdoms in ruins or usurped. This narrative skeleton fits the archaeological reality of the collapse almost too well, a garbled but powerful memory of an era defined by grand alliances, shattered cities, and a generation of leaders who never made it back to a stable home. It is not a history book, but it is a profound cultural echo of a time when the entire world seemed to turn to chaos, when the sea was a highway for both danger and desperate exile. This phenomenon is not unique to Greece. Far to the east, in the lands of Canaan, Another set of ancient texts preserves a different kind of memory. The biblical book of Joshua describes a series of dramatic city conquests, settlements falling one after another to a new people entering the land. While scholars debate the precise historical context, the pattern and the timing are evocative. The late Bronze Age collapse saw the disintegration of the powerful Canaanite city-state system, many of which show those telltale layers of destruction. Into that power vacuum came new groups, including the early Israelites, as well as the Philistines, who are closely linked by archaeology to the Sea Peoples. The stories in Joshua may weave together generations of cultural experience, compressing the slow, turbulent process of societal breakdown and resurgence into a narrative of divinely ordained conquest. It is less a military report and more a foundational myth for a people defining themselves in the wake of a shattered old world. What both these epic traditions reveal is the deep psychological imprint of the collapse. When the palaces burned and the written record stopped, oral tradition became the only vessel for memory. Over centuries, kings could become demigods, droughts could become the wrath of deities, and the terrifying appearance of unknown warriors from the sea could transform into a single, monstrous threat. These myths served a vital purpose. They provided a framework for understanding a past that was otherwise incomprehensible, a way to explain why the grand ruins of Mycenae or Hazor lay in broken heaps. They transformed shared trauma into a source of identity and meaning, giving later generations a story of how their world was born from the ashes of a greater, fallen one. The legends are not factual history, but in their grand scale and their themes of loss, journey, and fragile homecoming, they may be the most truthful record we have of how it felt to live through the end of an age and to somehow begin again. Amidst the widespread devastation, islands of stability held firm against the tide. The collapse was not a uniform blackout across the entire map, but a patchwork of ruin and resilience, where the fate of a civilization often hinged on a single decisive battle or a deeply ingrained capacity for adaptation. The most famous survivor was Egypt. Under the determined leadership of Pharaoh Ramesses III, the kingdom prepared for the onslaught it knew was coming. The pharaoh fortified the Nile Delta, marshaled every available ship and soldier, and met the coalition of sea peoples in a monumental land and sea battle. Contemporary inscriptions claim the invaders were utterly destroyed, their confederation shattered. While this was likely an exaggeration for royal propaganda, the essential truth held: Egypt fought them to a standstill. The victory, however, was Pyrrhic. The kingdom was left exhausted, its treasury drained, and its control over distant territories like Canaan permanently severed. Egypt survived, but it did so by retreating behind its natural borders, entering a long period of diminished power and internal strife. It preserved the core of its civilization, its language, its gods, and its pharaonic traditions, but the era of its vast international empire was over. It emerged from the crisis as a venerable but wounded giant, a living museum of the old world that had somehow endured. Further north, along the cedar-forested coast of the Levant, a different kind of survival story was unfolding. While mighty inland capitals like Ugarit were reduced to ash, a handful of crucial port cities, including Byblos and Sidon, managed to persist. They were battered, yes, and likely paid heavy tribute to avoid destruction, but they kept their urban life and, most importantly, their maritime knowledge intact. From these embers, a brilliant new culture would soon rise: the Phoenicians. Their emergence is a masterclass in adaptation. With the Great Bronze Age empires gone and the old trade routes in ruins, the Phoenicians looked not inward but outward to the open sea. They used their surviving shipbuilding skills not for war, but to pioneer daring new trade routes across the entire Mediterranean. They established colonies from Cyprus to North Africa and eventually to the far shores of Spain, creating a decentralized, thalassocratic network that was far more flexible and resilient than the rigid, palace-controlled systems of the past. Their most lasting contribution was not a product, but a tool, a simplified alphabet derived from earlier scripts, designed for commerce and accessible beyond the scribble elite. This innovation would become the bedrock of later writing systems, including Greek and Latin. The Phoenicians did not just survive the collapse, they innovated their way out of it, building a new kind of economic and cultural world upon the ashes of the old. In the heart of Mesopotamia, another power endured by relying on a different strength, iron discipline. The Assyrian state, centered on cities like Ashur, was always a hardened, militaristic society. While it certainly felt the pressures of drought and regional instability, its core territories were less directly in the path of the Sea Peoples' main thrust. More importantly, its highly centralized and aggressive military apparatus allowed it to hold its ground and even capitalize on the weakness of its neighbors. As the Hittite Empire disintegrated to the west, Assyria began to slowly expand into the vacuum, absorbing territory and resources. It weathered the storm not through desperate naval battles or radical reinvention, but through a grim institutional toughness. The Assyrians would later build the first true Iron Age empire, using the new metal technology that began to spread in the wake of the bronze shortage. Their survival set the stage for the next act of Near Eastern history, proving that in an age of chaos, a society organized for relentless warfare could not only persist but begin to dominate. These phoenixes from the ashes teach us a crucial nuance about historical collapse. It is rarely a total extinction event. It is a severe filter. The kingdoms that disappeared, like the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, were often those most deeply embedded in and dependent upon the very international system that failed. Those that survived, whether through a heroic last stand like Egypt, agile reinvention like the Phoenicians, or sheer hardened resilience like Assyria, shared a critical trait. They found a way to adapt to the terrifying new rules of a broken world. Their stories shift our perspective from a simple tale of doom to a more complex mosaic of catastrophe and continuity, showing that even in history's darkest decades, the seeds of the next age are already taking root. Out of the smoldering ruins and abandoned farmlands, a new political map began to be drawn. The collapse of the great Bronze Age empires did not create an empty world, but a world of sudden, startling opportunity. Where once there had been monolithic kingdoms enforcing rigid borders, there were now open spaces, fragmented territories, and power vacuums stretching for hundreds of miles. Into these disrupted landscapes moved new peoples, groups whose identities had been forged in the fires of migration and conflict, now ready to build permanent homes. This was not an invasion in the traditional sense, but a great resettlement, a demographic tide flowing into the spaces left by receding empires. On the southern coast of Canaan, a people known as the Philistines established themselves in a pentapolis of 5 fortified cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Archaeology reveals a fascinating cultural blend here. Their early pottery is distinctly Aegean in style, linking them to the wider Sea Peoples phenomenon, but within a generation or two, it begins to incorporate local Canaanite influences. They brought new technologies like advanced ironworking and a distinct urban organization. The biblical tradition remembers them as formidable rivals, Goliath of Gath being the most famous example, but their historical role was as one of several new powers defining the post-collapse order. They filled the coastal vacuum left by the destroyed Egyptian and Canaanite administrations, becoming a major force in the region for centuries. Further north, in the Anatolian highlands where the Hittite Empire once stood, a different kind of rebirth was underway. The great capital of Hattusa was abandoned, but life did not cease. Emerging from the fragments of the old empire and likely incorporating new migrant groups, a constellation of smaller kingdoms arose. Among the most prominent were the Phrygians, who would later build the legendary city of Gordion. In the Syrian interior, another influential group, the Arameans, began to form cohesive tribal confederations and then full-fledged city-states like Damascus. Their greatest impact would be linguistic, their alphabet and tongue becoming the lingua franca of trade and diplomacy across the Near East for 1,000 years, the everyday language of an entire region. What we witness in this period is the fundamental clearing of the geopolitical board. The old players, with their entrenched bureaucracies and centuries-old treaties, were gone. The collapse effectively hit a reset button on political identity. In the absence of a dominant imperial power, local and regional groups could now coalesce into something new, defining themselves not by loyalty to a distant king in Hattusa or Thebes, but by shared language, custom, and the immediate need for collective security. This fragmentation and reorganization, while often unstable and marked by local conflicts, was incredibly fertile. It was from this turbulent soup of new peoples, the Philistines, the Phrygians, the Arameans, the early Israelites in the hill country, and others, that the vibrant patchwork of Iron Age kingdoms would eventually emerge. The story shifts here from one of pure loss to one of messy, difficult rebirth. The collapse did not end history, it forcibly rewrote its opening chapters, proving that the ashes of a fallen age can become the soil from which entirely new worlds grow. But the collapse was not merely a story of loss, it was a story of substitution. When the great trade routes shattered and the palace storehouses stood empty, societies were forced to find a new way to forge their world, quite literally. The scarcity of tin did not just mean a shortage of bronze, it created a powerful, desperate incentive to master a different metal, one that had been known for centuries but largely ignored by the elite. That metal was iron. This was not a simple upgrade like swapping out an old tool for a newer model. It was a fundamental reimagining of how technology worked and who controlled it. Bronze had been the metal of kings and empires, its production locked into a complex, centralized system. Iron would become the metal of the people, of local chieftains and village smiths, and its rise would permanently reshape the balance of power. To understand why, we need to look at the raw ingredients. Bronze required a delicate, long-distance marriage of copper and tin. Iron, by contrast, only asked for one thing: iron ore, which is one of the most common minerals on Earth. You could find it in boggy marshes, in certain clays, in rocky outcrops, almost anywhere. The trick was not finding it, but mastering the intense heat needed to smelt it, and the skillful forging required to make it strong. For the palace economies, this was not worth the trouble when the reliable bronze network was functioning. But when that network ceased to exist, the equation flipped entirely. Local communities, cut off from the imperial supply chain, began to experiment in earnest. They built taller furnaces, learned to manage charcoal fires at extreme temperatures, and developed the technique of carburization, hammering the hot metal to introduce carbon and create much harder steel. The process was difficult, and the early results were often inferior to high-quality bronze, being more brittle and prone to rust. But they had one overwhelming advantage: you could do it anywhere. A local chieftain no longer needed to petition a distant king or wait for a merchant ship from across the sea. He needed only a skilled smith, a source of ore, and a good supply of charcoal from the local forest. This was technological democratization. The means of production for the era's most crucial material shifted from the palace courtyard to the village forge. The social and military consequences were profound. When weaponry and tools could be produced locally, power decentralized. A charismatic leader with a loyal band of followers could now equip them with effective iron weapons without relying on a collapsing central authority. This fueled the rise of smaller, more mobile fighting forces and the patchwork of new kingdoms we see in the early Iron Age. Iron did not cause the Bronze Age collapse, but the collapse created the perfect conditions for iron to rise. And once it did, there was no going back. The age of empires built on controlled scarcity was over. replaced by a world where strength was increasingly forged in 1,000 local fires, a technological revolution born from the ashes of the old order. That concentrated wave of destruction gives us a new way to understand the collapse itself. The idea of a single decade of fire is not meant to be taken as a literal, precise stopwatch count, but as a powerful metaphor for the astonishing compression of catastrophe. The pressures that led to this moment, the droughts, the social strains, the brittle trade networks, those were slow burning, simmering for perhaps a generation or more. They were the gathering storm clouds, but the lightning strikes, the events that finally shattered these complex societies, appear in the archaeological record as a terrifyingly tight cluster. Look at the timeline mapped by the layers of ash. Major centers from Greece to the Levant show evidence of violent ends concentrated within a window of roughly 40 years, from around 1220 to 1180 BCE. In the grand sweep of ancient history, 40 years is the blink of an eye, barely more than a single human lifetime. Within that span, the palace of Pylos burned, the great port of Ugarit was reduced to rubble, the Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned, and countless other urban lights winked out. This compression is what makes the event feel so apocalyptic. It wasn't a gradual dimming over centuries, it was a sudden, synchronized blackout across a vast region. Think of it not as a slow decline, but as a historical tipping point. For decades, the interconnected system absorbed shocks, adapted, and persisted. But there comes a moment when the accumulated strain becomes too much, when one final push causes the entire structure to buckle all at once. That push was likely the convergence of the migratory Sea Peoples movement with the peak of the Great Drought and the internal failures of the palatial economies. It was the perfect storm arriving at the worst possible time. When that tipping point was reached, the collapse did not happen in slow motion, it happened with breathtaking speed. A king could send a desperate letter for help one season, and by the next his city could be a smoldering ruin, its population scattered, and its name fading from memory. This rapid unraveling explains why the collapse feels so complete, and why its legacy was so traumatic. The people who lived through it weren't watching a slow fade, they were witnessing their entire world, the only world they had ever known, being violently unmade within the span of their own adulthood. That experience of concentrated, incomprehensible loss is what echoes through the myths of a fallen age of heroes and the wrath of the gods. It is the difference between watching a tree slowly lose its leaves over autumn and seeing an entire forest consumed by a wildfire in a single, devastating night. The decade of fire reminds us that history is not always a gradual slope, sometimes it is a cliff, and the fall can be shockingly fast. So who or what was truly responsible for pulling the plug on this golden age? The search for a single, satisfying villain has consumed historians and archaeologists for generations, leading to a fascinating and ongoing debate that feels more like a detective's case file than a settled chapter in a textbook. One prominent school of thought, championed by historian Robert Drews, points decisively to the edge of a sword. His systems collapse theory argues that the primary catalyst was a sudden and devastating military revolution. He suggests that traditional Bronze Age armies, built around elite chariot warriors and massed infantry, were rendered obsolete by new tactics and weaponry. The key innovation, he proposes, was the widespread adoption of the javelin and the slashing sword, weapons that allowed lighter, more mobile infantry to overwhelm chariot forces and break the formations of palace guards. In this view, the Sea Peoples were not just raiders but the terrifying vectors of this new way of war. Their success on the battlefield, according to Drews, created a cascading military failure that the rigid, top-heavy palace systems simply could not withstand. The collapse, then, was less about famine or trade, and more about a shocking and rapid loss of the monopoly on violence that had upheld these kingdoms for centuries. It is a compelling argument that places human conflict and innovation at the very center of the catastrophe. Yet other scholars find this explanation too narrow, like trying to explain a hurricane by only studying the wind. Archaeologist Eric Klein offers a different, more integrative model, one he calls the perfect storm. He does not dismiss the role of the Sea Peoples or military upheaval, but he frames them as one powerful current in a much larger, converging system of disasters. In Klein's view, no single factor was sufficient to cause the collapse on its own. The Great Drought was a severe stressor, but societies had weathered dry periods before. The Sea Peoples were a formidable threat, but even they could have been repelled by a healthy, united kingdom. The internal rebellions were a symptom, not the disease itself. The true cause, he argues, was the catastrophic intersection of all these forces simultaneously. A kingdom weakened by famine and social unrest was far more vulnerable to invasion. An invasion that severed trade routes then exacerbated the famine and unrest elsewhere, creating a vicious, accelerating feedback loop that raced through the interconnected network. The debate between these perspectives and the many others in between is not merely academic. It enriches our understanding by forcing us to confront the complexity of historical change. There is no solitary villain in this story, no simple explanation. Instead, we see a fragile web of human and environmental forces, a system that thrived on interconnection until the day that very same interconnection became a conduit for total failure. This roundtable of theories reminds us that history is rarely about clean answers, but about learning to ask better questions of the silent evidence left behind. The survivors of the collapse offer more than just stories of endurance. They provide a blueprint for resilience in the face of systemic chaos. When we look at the kingdoms that did not just burn, Egypt and Assyria, we see a fascinating pattern of shared strengths, a kind of historical cheat sheet for weathering an existential crisis. Their survival was not mere luck, it was the result of specific, hard-coded advantages that the fallen empires lacked. The first and most obvious was geography. Both nations possessed a defensible core territory that acted as an ultimate fortress. For Egypt, it was the long, fertile ribbon of the Nile Valley, bounded by deserts to the east and west, the Mediterranean to the north, and cataracts to the south. This created a natural bottleneck, a contained ecosystem that an invading force could not easily overrun or bypass. Assyria's heartland, while less isolated, was centered on the Tigris River and surrounded by rugged hills, giving it a defensible stronghold from which to project power. When the fires spread across the coastal plains and the overland trade routes, these core regions became sanctuaries, places where the essential functions of civilization could retreat and hold fast. The second critical trait was institutional strength and bureaucratic continuity. While other palaces saw their scribble classes vanish and their administrative systems disintegrate, both Egypt and Assyria maintained a deeply entrenched, centralized state apparatus. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not just a king, he was a god-king, a figure of such profound cultural and religious authority that the state's legitimacy was nearly unshakable, even in dire times. This allowed Ramesses III to mobilize the entire country's resources, from grain stores to shipyards, with an efficiency that a fracturing Mycenaean Wanax or a besieged Hittite emperor could only dream of. Assyria's bureaucracy was built for a different purpose, relentless military expansion and control. But this meant it was inherently designed for crisis management and resource extraction under pressure. When the drought hit, these were states that could still count their people, levy taxes in kind, and direct labor to fortify borders, because the people running the system had not forgotten how. The third, often overlooked factor was agricultural redundancy. Egypt's entire existence was built around the predictable annual flooding of the Nile. While a great drought might reduce the flood's bounty, it rarely stopped it completely. The river provided a consistent, renewable source of irrigation and soil fertility that rain-fed agricultural systems, like those of the Hittites or Mycenaeans, simply did not have. This meant that even in terrible years, Egypt could usually produce some surplus. Assyria, for its part, had learned to diversify, developing sophisticated irrigation canals to supplement rainfall and spread its agricultural risk across a wider area. This lesson in redundancy is profound. The empires that fell were often hyper-specialized, their economies and diets reliant on a single, fragile system, whether it was rain-fed grain or long-distance tin imports. Egypt and Assyria, in their own ways, had built-in backups. Their survival teaches a timeless principle in a systemic crisis. The most resilient societies are often those with strong central coordination, a defensible home base, and a plan B for their most basic needs. They show us that collapse is not a random force of nature, but a stress test that ruthlessly exposes which structures are robust and which are merely impressive. The ruins of Hattusa and the burned palaces of Greece are not just ancient history, they are a mirror. When we look at the intricate, globalized world of the late Bronze Age, the reflection staring back is unsettlingly familiar. We too live in an era of profound interconnection, where a disruption on one continent can ripple through stock markets, store shelves, and social stability on another within days. Our world is bound by digital networks and just-in-time supply chains that, in their efficiency, have created a new kind of fragility. The great powers of the Bronze Age relied on tin from distant Afghanistan. We rely on rare earth minerals from specific global regions and complex semiconductor supply chains that span the planet. Their droughts, evidenced in ancient tree rings, find a haunting parallel in our own escalating climate challenges, with shifting weather patterns threatening agricultural stability from the American Midwest to the Mekong Delta. The diplomatic letters between Hittite and Egyptian kings, frantic with news of unrest, echo in today's tense geopolitical cables and summits. The lesson of the collapse is not that history repeats itself, but that certain patterns of vulnerability recur whenever human societies build something magnificent and complex. The interconnectedness that delivers our smartphones, our food, and our energy is the same interconnectedness that can amplify a crisis. The Bronze Age reminds us that no society is too grand to fail, and that prosperity built on long, brittle supply lines and a stable climate is a conditional kind of peace. So this ancient story poses a direct and urgent question to our modern age. Where are our single points of failure? Is it a narrow maritime strait through which a majority of the world's oil or container traffic flows? Is it a single region producing a vital component for everything from cars to medical equipment? Is it a shared digital infrastructure vulnerable to systemic shock? The collapse challenges us to look at our own web of dependencies not with pride alone, but with clear-eyed scrutiny. It urges us to think in terms of resilience, not just efficiency, to value redundancy and adaptability in our systems. Can we learn to build buffers into our supply chains, diversify our critical resources, and strengthen the social contracts within our nations so they do not fracture under pressure? The people of the Bronze Age did not see the cliff until they were over it. We have the unique advantage of being able to look back and see the cliff clearly marked in the archaeological record. Their decade of fire is our cautionary tale, a 3,000-year-old warning etched in ash, urging us to forge a future that is not only brilliant and connected, but also durable enough to withstand the inevitable storms. The fate of the Hittite Empire stands as the collapse's most haunting vanishing act. Here was a superpower that had dueled Egypt to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, a kingdom of lawgivers and diplomats whose archives contain treaties we can still read today. Yet its end is shrouded in a silence more complete than any other. The capital, Hattusa, was not merely sacked in a frenzied battle, it was meticulously abandoned. Archaeologists find evidence of a deliberate, orderly departure. The royal archives were baked in ovens, perhaps to preserve the clay tablets for a future return that never came. The city gates were sealed from the inside, then it was set aflame. This was not the random violence of a surprise attack, it was a planned funeral for a capital. So what force could compel an empire to perform its own last rites? The suspects are many, and they likely acted in concert. To the north, the semi-nomadic Kaskian tribes, long a thorn in the Hittite side, likely saw their chance, pressing down on a weakened frontier. The specter of the Sea Peoples looms, perhaps attacking the vital coastal supply ports, severing the empire's access to the Mediterranean grain and trade it desperately needed. Yet the most insidious enemy may have been one no army could fight. The Great Drought would have hit the Anatolian plateau with particular cruelty. The Hittite economy was built on grain and livestock, and without reliable rains, the entire system would have seized. A single clay tablet captures the crisis, a desperate letter from the last Hittite king to the ruler of Ugarit, pleading for an emergency shipment of grain. This is the sound of a government in its death throes, begging for food to stave off mass starvation. Imagine the scene in the countryside, farmers unable to pay taxes to a distant capital that could no longer protect them, local governors breaking away to save their own people, the social contract dissolving into a struggle for mere survival. The final blow was likely this combination, a climatic and economic stranglehold that triggered internal fragmentation, leaving Hattusa as an empty shell, a head with no body. Its rulers simply walked away, and the forest grew over the stones for 3,000 years. What makes the Hittite case so uniquely chilling is the completeness of the erasure. After the collapse, no new Hittite kingdom rose. Their language, their unique cuneiform script, their very name were forgotten, surviving only as cryptic references in Egyptian and biblical texts. They became a ghost in the historical record, a civilization that had to be rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. This total political and cultural disappearance forces us to ask a deeper question. What does it take for a people's entire identity to be lost? It suggests that collapse can be so profound that it doesn't just topple a government, it can sever the chain of memory itself, leaving a mystery buried in the soil, waiting for a modern world to piece together the story of its silent, spectacular fall. The final letters from Ugarit carry the weight of a world ending. This wealthy port city, nestled on the coast of what is now Syria, was not a remote outpost, it was the beating heart of Bronze Age commerce. Its harbor teemed with ships from Cyprus, Egypt, and Anatolia. Its warehouses overflowed with ivory, purple dye, and ingots of precious metals, and its scribes maintained a bustling international correspondence. Ugarit thrived because of its perfect position at the crossroads of empires. Yet when those empires began to crumble, that same perfect position became a death sentence, placing it directly in the crossfire of every converging disaster. The city's meticulously kept archives, preserved in the fire that destroyed it, offer us a real-time documentary of its final months. We can read the increasingly desperate correspondence of its last king, Amurapi. His letters reveal a ruler trying to hold together a collapsing reality. He writes to the king of Cyprus, a close ally and trade partner, pleading for assistance as enemy ships are sighted. In one poignant message, he explains he cannot send the troops he had promised because his own fleet is away on a mission, and more chillingly, because the enemy has already burned cities along the coast. He signs off with a phrase of profound helplessness, "I am like a bird in a trap." This is not the language of a king commanding his domain, but of a man watching the walls of his cage close in from all sides. The pressures on Ugarit were multifaceted and inescapable. To the north, its overlord and protector, the Hittite Empire, was disintegrating, leaving Ugarit without its traditional military shield. From the sea, the confederation of warriors we call the Sea Peoples approached. their attacks methodically eliminating the very coastal cities that formed Ugarit's network. There are even hints in the tablets of internal strain, perhaps local unrest or a failure of the social order as the crisis deepened. Hammurabi was trying to manage a diplomatic and military nightmare with resources that were evaporating by the day. The archaeological record confirms the totality of the city's fate. Excavations show Ugarit was not simply damaged in a raid, it was systematically and thoroughly destroyed. The palaces, the temples, the residential districts all bear the clear mark of intense, deliberate fire. The city was put to the torch and then abandoned. Unlike many ancient sites, Ugarit was never rebuilt as a major urban center on the same scale. Its glory was so completely extinguished that its very location was lost to history until modern archaeologists unearthed it. This makes Ugarit's story a perfect, heartbreaking microcosm of the entire collapse. It was the ultimate hub city, a place whose entire identity and wealth were built on facilitating the connections of a globalized system. When that system imploded, the hub had no purpose and no defense. Its destruction was a strategic decapitation, severing one of the last major links in the Mediterranean trade network. The bird in the trap was not just King Hammurabi, but the entire idea his city represented, a cosmopolitan world of open exchange, now suffocated by fire, drought, and the desperate movements of peoples with nowhere left to go. In its silent, ashen ruins, we see the final, flickering light of the Bronze Age international order going out. The silence that settled over Greece was profound and lasting. For nearly 400 years, from roughly 1100 to 750 BCE, the landscape entered what we now call the Greek Dark Age. This was not a time of evil or moral decline, but a period of profound cultural amnesia and simplification, where the brilliant, complex world of the Mycenaean palaces faded into a distant, half-remembered legend. The archaeological record tells a stark story. Where there had been bustling palace complexes and wide-ranging trade, there were now small, scattered villages, often perched on defensible hills far from the coast. The population plummeted, perhaps by as much as 90%. The grand arts of fresco painting, intricate gold working, and monumental stone architecture vanished completely. Most significantly, the skill of writing, the linear B script used by the palatial bureaucrats to track everything from chariot wheels to religious offerings, was utterly lost. For centuries, no one in Greece could read or write a single word. It was a return to a purely oral culture, where history, law, and identity were held in memory and spoken aloud. Life in these isolated villages was necessarily local and self-sufficient. Without long-distance trade, communities had to produce everything they needed themselves, from pottery to tools. The material culture became simpler, more utilitarian. The beautiful, stylized pottery of the Mycenaeans gave way to plain, geometric designs. Grand palaces were replaced by modest, oval-shaped huts made of mud brick and thatch. The intricate social hierarchies and specialized professions of the Bronze Age dissolved. In many ways, it was a societal reset, a return to a more basic form of community organization where leadership was likely based on kinship and personal prowess rather than inherited royal bureaucracy. This was not a prosperous time, but it was a necessary one. The old system, with its extreme centralization and dependency, had catastrophically failed. The Dark Age was the long, slow process of building something new from the ground up, free from the shadow of the fallen palaces. Yet within this apparent stagnation, subtle seeds of the future were germinating. One of the most important developments was the adoption of a new technology, ironworking. As we discussed, the bronze trade had collapsed, but iron ore was plentiful in Greece. Villagers began to forge their own simple iron tools and weapons, a practical innovation that decentralized economic power and made communities more self-reliant. Another crucial change was happening in the realm of burial practices. In the Mycenaean era, the elite were often buried in lavish, beehive-shaped tombs with rich grave goods, emphasizing a stark class divide. In the Dark Age, a new practice emerged: individual cremation burials placed in simple parts. This shift suggests a move toward a society that placed greater value on the individual, or at least on smaller family units, rather than a rigid, pyramid-like social structure. The old gods were not forgotten, but worship became localized, centered on small family or village shrines rather than grand state temples. This long period of simplification and localism created the essential conditions for Greece's most famous political invention, the independent city-state or polis. With no overarching palace authority to dictate terms, these scattered villages had to learn to govern themselves. They had to make collective decisions about defense, land use, and dispute resolution. Over centuries, as populations slowly grew again, these villages sometimes coalesced into larger communities for mutual protection, often around a fortified hill or acropolis. Political imagination that had been constrained by palace walls was now free to experiment. Different communities developed different models, some leaning toward oligarchy, others toward broader forms of citizenship. The slate had been wiped clean. The collapse of the monolithic Mycenaean world made space for a vibrant, competitive, and decentralized political landscape. The Greek Dark Age teaches us a paradoxical historical truth. Sometimes a total collapse does not lead to eternal darkness, but to a necessary clearing. The dense forest of the old order had to fall so that new and different saplings could find the light. The grandeur of classical Athens, with its democracy and philosophy, and the fierce independence of Sparta, were not direct descendants of the Mycenaean palaces. They were the distant grandchildren of those small, resilient villages that learned to survive and then to thrive in the long silence after the fire. The loss of writing was a cultural catastrophe, but it also meant that when writing returned to Greece, it came in a new and revolutionary form. The alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, a tool far more accessible for recording poetry, law, and history than the old bureaucratic linear B. From the ashes of a unified, top-down civilization arose a fragmented, fiercely competitive, and brilliantly creative new world. The darkness, it seems, was not an end but a long, quiet gestation. The story of the collapse is written not only in clay and ash, but also in the silent, slow-growing archives of the natural world. To understand the true scale of the drought that gripped the ancient world, we must turn to a different kind of detective work, one that uses nature's own records as a time machine. Modern climate scientists, known as paleoclimatologists, have developed remarkable methods to peer into the atmospheric conditions of 3,000 years ago. They drill deep into the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes, extracting long cores of sediment. Within these cores, they find preserved grains of pollen, a microscopic fossil record of the surrounding vegetation. By identifying the types of plants that thrived in a given layer, they can map how forests gave way to dry scrubland, painting a vivid picture of a landscape slowly desiccating. In dark, still caves, another clock ticks. Stalagmites, those stone pillars rising from cave floors, grow incrementally over millennia from mineral-rich water dripping from the ceiling. The chemical signature of the water, its stable isotopes, changes subtly with rainfall patterns and temperature. By carefully slicing open a stalagmite and analyzing these isotopes layer by layer, researchers can reconstruct a year-by-year chronicle of ancient droughts and wet periods with astonishing precision. Perhaps the most direct record comes from the rings of ancient trees. In a good year with ample rain, a tree adds a wide, robust ring. In a year of drought and stress, the ring is agonizingly narrow, a tight band of hardship etched into the wood. By studying the patterns of wide and narrow rings in long-lived species like the bristlecone pine or in preserved timbers from archaeological sites, scientists can build a calendar of climatic good times and bad, stretching back for centuries. What this suite of natural evidence reveals is a stark and undeniable trend, beginning around the year 1200 BCE and lasting for nearly 2 centuries. The Eastern Mediterranean and Near East entered a period of severe and sustained aridity. The data shows not just a few bad years, but a profound, multi-generational shift toward a drier, harsher climate. This independent physical confirmation is crucial. It moves the Great Drought from being a convenient theory suggested by ancient texts mentioning famine to a documented physical reality that shaped every aspect of life. The pollen shows ecosystems transforming. The stalagmites reveal rainfall becoming scarce and unreliable. The tree rings tell a story of relentless stress on every living thing. When we overlay this climatic map with the archaeological map of destruction, the correlation is chilling. The periods of most intense drought align perfectly with the decades of collapse, the fires, the abandonments, and the desperate migrations. This scientific detective work does something profound. It weaves environmental history and human history into a single, inseparable narrative. We see that the fate of kings and empires was intimately tied to the behavior of clouds and the fertility of the soil. The climate crisis of the Late Bronze Age was not a backdrop to the story. It was a central character, a slow, relentless pressure that bent the pillars of civilization until they could bear no more weight. It reminds us that human ambition, no matter how grand, always operates within the boundaries set by the natural world. And when those boundaries suddenly contract, even the mightiest societies must adapt or face the consequences. This evidence from lakes, caves, and trees grants us a humbling perspective, allowing us to witness not just what people did, but the immense environmental forces they were struggling against, a struggle written in the very fabric of the planet they called home. Beneath the feet of kings and farmers alike, the very ground could turn traitor. While drought parched the fields and invaders gathered at the gates, another silent, unpredictable force may have been at work, one that shook the foundations of cities both literally and spiritually. Some archaeologists examining the widespread destruction layers have noted a puzzling detail. The pattern of collapsed walls and shattered masonry at certain sites does not always look like the result of a siege. Instead, it bears the distinctive signature of a much older adversary, the earthquake. The Eastern Mediterranean sits upon a fractured web of tectonic boundaries, a region perpetually restless. What if, in that fateful century, the Earth's restlessness reached a violent crescendo? The theory of a storm of earthquakes proposes that a cluster of major seismic events rippled across the region within a short time frame. Such a sequence would have been catastrophic for societies already stretched to their breaking point. A powerful quake would not just topple homes, it would rupture vital aqueducts and irrigation canals, crippling a city's water supply amid a drought. It would crumble the formidable defensive walls that were a kingdom's pride, leaving its heart exposed and vulnerable just as rumors of approaching armies began to circulate. The psychological and cultural impact would have been equally devastating. In a world where natural disasters were seen as messages from the gods, a series of earthquakes would have been interpreted as the ultimate divine rejection. Priests and oracles would have scrambled for meaning, perhaps declaring that the king had lost the favor of the heavens, or that the people had committed some grave offense. This seismic divine wrath would have shattered morale, eroding the last vestiges of confidence in the established order. Imagine a city like Ugarit or Mycenae, already struggling with food shortages and social tension, suddenly struck by a tremor that brings down part of the palace. In the chaos and dust, is that a sign from the gods to abandon the rulers, or merely a tragic coincidence? The line between natural disaster and supernatural judgment would have blurred completely, accelerating the internal unraveling we've already seen. This geological wild card adds a crucial layer of chaos to the perfect storm. It suggests that the collapse was not an orderly domino fall, but a chaotic convergence where human and environmental crises amplified each other in unpredictable ways. A quake-damaged city becomes an easier target for attack. Its refugees swell the ranks of the desperate, and its fall sends a shockwave of panic and instability along the trade routes. While not the sole cause, increased seismic activity could have been the destabilizing push that turned a dire situation into an inescapable catastrophe, a reminder that sometimes when everything seems to be falling apart, the very earth beneath our feet decides to join in. The label Sea Peoples carries a weight of ancient terror, a name etched in stone by their victims. But what if this image of faceless, destructive barbarians is a profound oversimplification, a story told only by the kingdoms that burned? To truly understand the collapse, we must attempt to see the world through their eyes, to move beyond the Egyptian carvings of chaotic battles and imagine the human reality behind the migration. These were not mindless hordes descending upon a peaceful world. They were, in all likelihood, people whose own homes had already collapsed. The same great drought that withered the fields of the Hittites and the Mycenaeans would have devastated the Aegean islands, the coastal regions of Anatolia, and beyond. The same failures in the palatial trade networks that caused famine in the empires would have struck their societies first, perhaps with even greater severity if they were on the periphery of that system. Their migration was not a chosen invasion, but a desperate response to an existential threat. They traveled not as an army of lone warriors, but as entire societies on the move, with women, children, elders, and whatever possessions they could carry. The clay tablets from Ugarit mention enemy ships, but they also describe families loaded onto ox carts, a poignant detail of a people carrying their entire world with them, seeking not just plunder but soil that could still support life. This reframing is crucial. It transforms the narrative from a simple story of civilized versus savage into a tragic picture of a domino effect, where systemic failure in one region pushed vast populations into another, creating a cascade of displacement and conflict. The most successful of these groups, the Philistines, settled on the southern coast of Canaan and within a generation were building thriving, sophisticated cities like Ashkelon and Gath. Their material culture shows a fascinating blend of Aegean traditions and local Canaanite influences, evidence of adaptation and complex society, not mere destruction. Seeing the Sea Peoples as desperate migrants caught in the same collapsing system as the empires they attacked does not excuse the violence, but it deepens our understanding of the period's chaos. It reminds us that in times of total systemic breakdown, the distinction between invader and refugee often dissolves, leaving only the shared, desperate struggle for survival on a planet that seemed to have turned against everyone. The collapse was not a single event, but a chain reaction of interlocking failures. To see the full picture, we must watch these threads twist together into one devastating chord. It begins with the sky. The Great Drought, stretching for generations, did its slow, silent work. Fields that had fed empires for centuries began to fail. Harvests dwindled, then vanished. In the palaces, the grain stores, the very foundation of the social contract, grew alarmingly empty. This was the first and most profound pressure, a creeping hunger that eroded the bonds between rulers and the ruled. Famine does not just weaken bodies, it unravels societies. Desperate communities began to look beyond their borders for survival, setting entire populations into motion. These were the Sea Peoples, not a mysterious barbarian horde, but a wave of human desperation, whole families on the move because the land behind them could no longer sustain life. Their migration was both a symptom of the collapse and its most violent accelerant. As these displaced groups moved along the coastlines, they attacked the vital port cities that were the nervous system of the Bronze Age world. With each harbor burned, a critical node in the network was severed. The flow of tin and copper ceased, and with it, the ability to forge new bronze tools and weapons. The palace economies, already strained by famine, now faced industrial paralysis. They could not feed their people, and soon they could not arm their soldiers. This economic and military stranglehold triggered intense internal unrest. Why remain loyal to a king who can neither fill your stomach nor protect your home? Social order fractured from within. Local governors may have hoarded resources, villages likely broke away, and the central authority of the palaces crumbled under the weight of its own failed promises. It is possible that natural disasters like earthquakes added a final, destabilizing blow, shaking the physical and spiritual confidence of these beleaguered kingdoms. The result was a catastrophic convergence, a kingdom weakened by hunger and internal strife, its trade routes cut and its arsenals empty, was utterly unprepared to face a determined external force. The collapse did not happen in a slow, orderly decline. It happened in a rapid, domino-like sequence. The failure of one kingdom placed unbearable strain on its neighbors, who were themselves buckling under the same combination of pressures. Within the span of a few decades, the political map of the ancient world was violently redrawn. The great palaces became silent mounds of ash, the intricate bureaucracy of writing was forgotten, and a long twilight settled over the landscape. This synthesis reveals the true nature of the disaster. No single factor, not the drought, not the migrations, not the trade collapse, could have done this alone. It was their tragic intersection, a perfect storm where environmental crisis, human movement, economic interdependence, and social fracture amplified one another into an unstoppable wave. The brilliance of the Bronze Age, its deep connections and specialized systems, became the very engine of its destruction when the world it was built for suddenly and violently changed. The embers of that ancient world still glow, offering a quiet, urgent wisdom for our own time. The collapse of the Bronze Age stands as one of history's most compelling warnings about the fragility of civilization itself. It was not the work of a single, spectacular cataclysm, but the tragic and intricate convergence of a changing climate, systemic economic failure, and the profound human conflicts that arise when the foundations of life begin to crumble. This story teaches us that the greatest threats are rarely singular. They are woven together, each strand making the others stronger until the entire tapestry unravels. As we look back on those decades of fire, we see a mirror reflecting our own world's deep vulnerabilities, but also its remarkable strengths. We too are bound by delicate threads of trade and communication that span the globe. We too face environmental challenges that test the resilience of our societies. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable, but that resilience is a choice. It is built in the decisions we make about redundancy in our systems, about strengthening the bonds within our communities, and about facing global challenges with cooperation rather than division. Let this ancient story inspire not fear, but thoughtful reflection. It asks us to consider what we value, what we depend upon, and how we can build a world that is not only brilliant and connected, but also durable, one capable of weathering the storms that history tells us will inevitably come. If you found this journey into the past illuminating, subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What parallels do you see between that ancient crossroads and the world we are building today?